The Life of Dwight Moody, Chapter 33, Visit to the Holy Land. As early as January 1887, Mr. and Mrs. Peter McKinnon of Scotland urged Mr. Moody to accompany them to Palestine. That invitation touched a very sympathetic chord, and evident from the response called forth. My dear Mrs. McKinnon, yours of January 10th came today. I could hardly keep back the tears as I thought of going to Calvary, Gethsemane, and the Mount of Olives with you. My heart is with you, and I cannot tell you what a self-denial it is to me not to go. For years I have wanted to do so, and though I have never left my work for the pleasure in my life, I think I should have gone this time if I had not been as I am. For 3 years they have been trying to get me to go to Chicago, and I told them that if they would do certain things, I would give them 3 months. They have done what I asked them to do, and so I must stay here now until April or May. I do long to take a trip and would like to go with you and your husband more than any one else, but I must decline for another thing. Miss Holton, footnote, a cousin and for many years a member of his household, Miss Holton was one of Mr. Moody's most effective helpers in establishing the Northfield Seminary, end of footnote, is dying, and I would go to her if I could get away. She is in California, and the letter that came last night says she will not live 30 days, and I cannot go to her. Poor Fanny, how sad it is for her to lay down her work and die. But I am glad she is ready, and is not dreading death as she once was. The sting is all gone. But it is so hard to die away from her sisters. Remember me to all old friends. Think of me, and pray for me in the garden and on Olivet and at Calvary. And take one good look while in Bethany, and see if you can see the place where the Master was once seen, and ask him to come back again. Thank you again for your great kindness. Yours as ever, D.L. Moody. In February 1892, a generous and cordial invitation was repeated. Mr. Moody was then engaged in Scotland, and it was impossible for him to leave the work. That was his response. Parsley, Scotland, February 10th, 1892. My dear Mrs. McKinnon, I would be glad to go to Palestine, but there are some reasons that will keep me. First, to work. It would be a pity to leave it now, and I am committed until the 1st of April. Second, in April, when it grows warmer, I come down with a headache and suffer a great deal unless I keep where it is cool. Third, my wife says that Palestine is said to be unhealthy, and no one can go there in the spring. So I think if I ever see the land of Abraham and his children, I shall have to see it when I am in another body, and it may be I will see it with Christ himself. I cannot tell you how glad I am your husband is better. Tell him I pray for him daily, and trust it will be the will of God to lift him up again. I did not know I loved him so much until I heard he was sick. Mr. Sankey has gone up to London to attend the funeral of Mr. Spurgeon. They wanted me to go, but I could not get away. The churches, halls, etc. were all engaged, and this kept me. I am thankful to tell you the work is good here, and I have much to encourage me. Yet I get homesick at times and long to see my family. May the blessing of God rest on you and your dear husband, is the prayer of your true friend, D.L. Moody. A man of such energetic spirit as Mr. Moody found very little opportunity for holidays. He scarcely tried to observe one day in 7 as a rest day, but otherwise he was almost constantly occupied, except when journeying, and even then people recognized him and sought his spiritual advice, and were not denied. Of late years, with the multiplication of his schools, conferences, and other organizations for promoting the cause of Christ, there was less and less opportunity for withdrawing for any length of time from active participation in their control. Still anxious to carry out their plan, Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon deferred their trip until April, and finally prevailed on Mr. Moody to accompany them. Taking his wife and his son Paul, he went from Paris to Rome. Then he went to join Mr. McKinnon's party. His interest in everything about him was intense, and as usual, it centered particularly in the people and their methods of life. The farming on the hillside especially attracted his attention. To see men living in their little houses, perched like crows in a nest in the edge of the snow line, reclaiming patches of land, some of them hardly 20 feet square, excited his wonder. He would frequently say, "Look here, see that hillside farming? That beats all I ever saw. If I ever hear a Northfield man complaining of his farm again, I'll fall on him." This reference to his size caused much merriment. On their arrival at Rome, Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon joined the party, and after breakfast, they made a tour of the city with a guide. Mr. Moody was unusually silent when going through the beautiful churches, speaking only occasionally. The Colosseum proved a great attraction. He sat on a huge column that was lying on the ground and surveyed the amphitheater, calling up the various historic accounts of the scenes of murder, cruelty, and martyrdom enacted there. A stalwart peasant passed by one of the corridors, and Mr. Moody stopped him. "Tell him he is a fine, powerful man," he said to Ortina, the guide. Ortina did so. The peasant beamed at all the party and spoke rapidly in Italian. "What did he say?" asked Mr. Moody. "He said he was heavier, but he is losing flesh. He was too poor to drink wine. If he had wine, he would look sleek like you." "Tell him I am a teetotaler," said Mr. Moody. Ortini did so. The man smiled incredulously, as if such a thing were impossible. "Tell him it is true," said Mr. Moody. The man, still laughing, sat producing a loaf from beneath his coat. "You may be a teetotaler in drink, but you are no teetotaler in eating." The peasant said he had only 2 francs a day for his family of 7 children. Mr. Moody advised him to go to America and then gave him a 2-franc piece. The party passed on. The man called to the guide and ran back, holding out the piece of money. "What is the matter?" said Mr. Moody. He said, "It is the Pope's money, and is not good in Rome. Will you give him another piece?" Mr. Moody could hardly realize that the Pope's silver was not good in Rome, but exchanged the piece of money for another. He was greatly impressed by the place of historic interest. Anything that had a touch of Paul's life in it moved him deeply. Every place that could be verified as being in any way connected with Mr. Moody's great Bible hero was carefully sought out. The Reverend J. Gordon Gray took him out to the Appian, that's Appian, way, and when the original pavement was reached, Mr. Moody insisted on alighting from the carriage and going on foot over the stones which St. Paul had trodden as he entered Rome. The ruins of Neo's palace on the Palatine Hill had far more attraction for him than St. Peter's or any of the spectacles of modern Rome. He seemed to take great delight in the many monuments which Rome had erected to Paul, saying that the emperors who tyrannized the earth were remembered only by ruins. When he visited St. Peter, he spoke of the sad degeneration of the communion service from the poor faith of the early church. In the evening, Mr. Moody preached in the Presbyterian church, of which Dr. Gray was pastor. About 130 people were present. The sermon delivered was one that he gave on the last afternoon in Kansas City on grace, from the text, "The grace of God that bringeth salvation," etc. Friday, April 8th, the party started for Naples and sailed from there for Port Said, which was reached 4 days later. Writing for Port Said, Mr. Moody said, "We are now near where the children of Israel passed when they went out of Egypt. The country is sandy and barren, but the canal is a wonder, and it seems strange to be in this land of the Pharaohs, of Moses and Aaron and Joseph." After coaling the steamer at Port Said, they sailed to the Suez Canal in Ismailia. Little sleep was taken that night. About midnight, they passed the old Syrian road at Kandahar, where the ancient Jews and others traveled from Europe and Asia into Egypt, where no doubt Joseph was carried by the caravan. In Ismailia, a train was taken to Alexandria through the land of Goshen, full of interest to every Bible student. Mr. Moody's thirst for information was satisfied here, as everywhere, by an early morning rise with a guide before the rest of the party were up. At Alexandria, a boat was taken for Joppa. The Holy Land was sighted on Good Friday. The landing of Joppa was not made until late in the afternoon, and about 4 o'clock the start was made for Jerusalem. Supper was eaten at Ramleth. Mr. Moody finished before the rest and said he would go out into the air. When the party was ready to start, he was nowhere to be seen, and calling failed to reach him. The carriages were entered, and after a while he was overtaken. He had informed the guide that he was going on before, but was now beginning to be frightened, as he had seen several dark-looking Arabs scowling as they passed and spitting at him, and he thought it wiser to take the carriage. The moon rose brightly over the mountains as the carriages drove on. About 1 o'clock, a cup of coffee was served at Colonieth, Colonieh. Active signs of life were seen along the road. Caravans with camels, heavily laden, passed many times. Jerusalem was reached at 3 o'clock Saturday morning, and after a few hours' rest, a walk was taken about the city, out to the tomb of David, alongside of which was a little house, where in an upper chamber it is said that the Master ate the Last Supper. Mr. Moody was incredulous on all the traditional sites seen in Jerusalem, except the Temple and Calvary. He said the most of the localities were obscure, but the hills you cannot change nor remove. Mr. George D. Mackay of New York, who joined the party on the trip, says of the first day of the Holy City, our walk around Zion Hill finished at the Joppa Gate. Just before reaching it, we saw a group of leopards. The sight was pitiful in the extreme. The thought of contamination was utmost, and we hurried by, anxious to pass such misery. In the afternoon, Paul Donald, Mr. Mackey's son, and I got donkeys and rode to the top of the Mount of Olives. On the way, we passed Calvary. Mr. Moody took his Bible early Easter morning and sat on the Mount of Olives. In the afternoon, he preached to a large audience on Calvary under the aspect of the English Church Missionary Society. At least 300 people were present, largely native and visiting Christians. Some, spelled Mussulmans, and Jews came to listen, attracted by the crowd. Mr. Moody was in excellent spirits and preached with an emotion that he had rarely, if ever, equaled in any sermon. He heartily chose a text, beginning by saying that he had preached for 30 years, but had never felt the awe of God that he did at that moment. He pointed out the various spots and sites and linked them with their stories in the Bible, Mizpah and Samuel, Moriah and Abraham, the distant hills of Moab and Ruth, Olivet and Jesus. He likened the sacrifice of Isaiah to the coming offering up of Jesus, and spoke of how Jesus must have felt as he passed this hill in a boyhood, knowing that there he should offer up his life. He spoke of the feast that Jesus had attended on yonder temple site, and how the burden of his preaching at each one was the new birth in the power of the Spirit, and closed, after saying that the greatest blessing of his life had been the birth in the Spirit, by an appeal to every Christian person to seek God until the baptism of the Spirit should be as fire in their hearts, like that called down by Elijah on the altar of Carmel. The sermon was preached with a fervor beyond description, and left an ineffaceable impression on all who heard it. A collection was taken at the conclusion for the London Jews Society School, whose scholars and members were 80 boys and girls attending the meeting. The weekdays were spent in visiting places of interest in Jerusalem and the immediate vicinity. One day was devoted to Hebron. In Jerusalem, all the sacred spots, like the Holy Sepulchre, were too uncertain, or else too transformed by doughtiness to please him. On Monday, the party went to Bethlehem and Solomon's Pools. At Bethlehem, they drank at the well so dearly loved by David, and photographed a group of Arabs at the curb. There they saw the hills where, no doubt, David tended his flocks, and wrote many of the Psalms, and also the field of Boaz, and the shepherd's field. Later they visited the Church of the Nativity. Mr. Moody's favorite places were the Mount of Olives, to which he repeatedly returned in the little village of Bethany over the brow of the hill. Here, at any rate, he knew he was in the midst of the scenes where the Master had often walked. When he went to Bethany with Mrs. Moody, Mr. and Mrs. McKinney, and Miss Love, their arrival was celebrated as usual. A horde of children were sent as a general reception committee to extract from the visitors what baksheesh they could in the way of silver, copper, lead, and zinc, which the coin of the Turkish realm furnishes in such infinite and deceptive variety. Some pretended blindness or deafness to work on the visitor's pity. Others carried babies whose chubby little hands were hardly big enough to clutch the coin they held them out for. They immediately surrounded Mr. Moody. He was always generous, on this occasion especially so, because of the unusual nature of the place and its beautiful traditions. He asked if any of them had the name of Mary or Martha, and was agreeably surprised to learn that a number of them had. This opened his pockets again. The news of his generosity rapidly spread through the village, and new faces and hands were quickly added to the crowd, all surging around him in frantic efforts to get the lion's share of the spoils. He was besieged. They swarmed on every side. Bashiv, gift money. Bashivs, they cried. It was difficult to move. The visit to Bethany was rapidly converting itself into a fight for existence. The cause was getting desperate, so he called a truce. He called the dragoman to ask them to be quiet while he made an address. He did so. Then Mr. Moody talked, and the dragoman interpreted. He said, in substance, I have come 6,000 miles to see this little village of Bethany. It was a place my master loved to visit, and I have come to see it because he loved it. I am very glad to meet you all, and I hope you will grow up to be good men and good women. Now I want to be alone. I have no more. Bashi, and I bid you all goodbye. A fine-looking young man, about 16 years old, said he wanted to reply to the address. He spoke firmly, and with the grace of an orator, he said, We are glad to see the gentleman and his friends who have come so far, but the gentleman must not think that his actions are equal to the importance of his visit. 6,000 miles is a long way to come, and the gentleman must have sacrificed much to make the visit. In consequence, it is natural for us to expect that he would be magnificent in his gifts of Bashif, which he has not been, and we expect that he will now give a great deal more. Mr. Moody, who had regarded with surprise and delight the eloquency and grace of the boy, was so disgusted at the conclusion that he took flight. I did think that boy had a soul above Bashif, he said. Someone casually asked Mr. Moody whether he thought any of the children was named Mary or Martha. Certainly, why not? Nothing, only these were all boys. Mr. Mackay thus described the visit to the Marquis of Omar. In the Marquis, we all wore felt slippers, which they tied on over our shoes. Mr. McKinnon carried a pair of slippers and put them on. This is necessary, so no heathen foot must touch the sacred floor. Somehow, Paul Moody's slippers came off, and to our consternation, he was discovered by one of the masked officers to be tramping about with his infidel foot bared on the sole of his shoe. The scene that followed was enough to terrify him. The air was full of Arabic indignation. There was a rushing and a scolding and a wild excitement that was growing decidedly distressing. Paul stood holding his foot up so that he would not further contaminate the floor. His mother, pale and nervous, was assisting him, but looking as if she could give anything to get out alive. Arabs began to assemble and jabbers ferociously. Meanwhile, some wise attendants had got a new pair of slippers, and when Paul was reshod, we began to breathe freshly and freely, especially as we saw the Arabs were growing calmer and apparently were going to work no vengeance. My own shoe was appearingly through the wearing felt, and I began to feel squeamish myself when I thought the exposure of one half of the sole of my shoe, which was visible every step I took, might repeat the scene we had just gone through. One morning at 5 o'clock, in company with Mr. Mackay, Mr. Moody went to the Mount of Olives. It rained, and as they ascended, a beautiful rainbow spanned the city, its base resting on the temple court at one end, and just beyond the gate of Herod at the other. It looked like a rainbow of promise of the glory to come at Jerusalem. Mr. Moody was surprised when they reached the crest of the mountain, as he had not expected to see such a glorious view of the hills of Judah, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan Valley. He was greatly delighted. Their special quest was the Mount of Ascension, as neither was satisfied with the spot shown. On the Bethany spur of the mountain, the two travelers reading again the story of Lazarus and the ascension of Jesus. Together they prayed, Mr. Moody pleading with the Lord to come quickly and to sanctify their visit to that spot by their growth in grace. He was deeply moved and prayed most fervently. It was fully 11 o'clock when they returned, having been nearly 5 hours on the mountain. In the afternoon they went to the Jews' wailing place and the pool of Siloam. When it rained, Mr. Moody sent for 2 members of the London Jewish Society, who called at the hotel, and for 2 hours he and the rest of the party who wished to do so plied them with questions about the interesting points in Jerusalem. Once, seeing some poppies at the East Temple wall, he said, "Look there, drops of blood, a symbol of the blood shed for sin." It seemed as though the ground itself was testifying for Christ against the unbelief of the city. The native children in Jerusalem amused him greatly. On his exit from the hotel, he would invariably be surrounded by a crowd of ragged little Arabs and entertain himself by giving them baksheesh. The older natives interested him also, and he conversed with them, constantly questioning them as to their habits. By the end of the week, he was well informed as to the manner of the life of the people, the conditions of agriculture, the system of government, and a dozen other things. On a second Sunday in Jerusalem, Mr. Moody was up at 4 o'clock to see the sunrise on the Mount of Olives. He wanted to see the sun come up beyond the hills of Moab. His visit was successful, and he joined his party at breakfast much pleased. He said that he had seen the sun rise, and that as he looked over this land of promise, in his imagination he saw Moses' face, surrounded by the sun as a halo. He was in ecstasy over the beautiful eastern view from the Mount of Olives, the valley of Jordan, the Dead Sea, the hills of Moab, all seeming only 5 miles away, although more than 20. In the afternoon, Mr. Moody preached beneath Calvary on the west. There was a rumor that the government had forbidden any Turkish subject to attend the meeting at Calvary under the pain of arrest, but there was no truth in it. The Mohammedans had criticized Mr. Moody's preaching from a tombstone in their cemetery the previous Sunday. Mr. Moody said, "I don't blame them. I wouldn't want any man to stand on my father's grave to preach a sermon." The truth was that the cemetery on Calvary was such a dilapidated affair that the visitors took it for a deserted cemetery, as indeed it was. Mr. Moody preached on the Good Samaritan to an audience about as large as that of Easter Day. At the close of the sermon, he announced that on the previous Sunday the collection was 20 pounds, although he had only asked for 10. He now wanted 10 pounds more for a blind boy to go to the Church Missionary Society school for a year. The hat was passed, and again 20 pounds was raised. On Monday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Moody and Paul went again to the Mount of Olives, and at noon they started for Joppa. "This ends my 3 weeks with Mr. Moody," writes Mr. Mackay. "It has been a blessed experience for me." Mr. McKinnon's party then returned to Egypt. Several days were spent in Cairo visiting the pyramids and other points of interest, and in the first week of May the party started for Italy. May was spent in Naples and Florence, the Italian lakes, and Switzerland, and by the end of the month Mr. Moody was again in England, having been absent for 2 months, probably the longest vacation he had ever taken since he had entered business as a boy of 17. It was not an unbroken rest, however, for he had preached in Rome, Jerusalem, Cairo, Naples, and Paris, sometimes twice a day, besides conducting numerous Bible readings to gratify the importunities of English and American friends who recognized him wherever he went. Moreover, he used to lead the most unlikely people on the most unlikely occasions into direct personal talk regarding their spiritual condition. "Mr. Moody," said a lady of rank, "no one ever talked to me like this before." "Then it is quite time somebody did so," he replied, and they remained good friends thereafter. His visit to the Holy Land remained a vivid, living memory. He constantly referred to it in private conversation and public discourse, regretting on the one hand the present mean condition of Palestine, which, however, he believed was in accord with prophecy, and on the other looking forward with joy to its restoration, when the feet of the Messiah shall once more stand on Olivet.